Margaret stood in the hallway of her own home, staring at her bedroom door, the same door she'd walked through every night for 37 years. But now, a shiny new deadbolt gleamed back at her, and she could hear voices whispering on the other side. The keys in her trembling hand suddenly felt foreign, useless. After 3 weeks in the hospital fighting for her life, she'd come home to discover she was no longer welcome in her own sanctuary. Margaret had always believed in the quiet strength of routine. At 62, she'd built a life that felt as solid as the oak dining table her late husband had crafted with his own hands. Her daughter Claire lived just 20 minutes away, calling every Sunday without fail. Her son-in-law Derek had become the son she'd never had, fixing leaky faucets and mowing her lawn without being asked. When her granddaughter Emma started college, Margaret had been the one to help with tuition, dipping into her carefully saved retirement fund without hesitation. The house on Maple Street had been her haven for nearly 4 decades. Every corner held memories: Christmas mornings with wrapping paper scattered like confetti, birthday parties where the kitchen overflowed with laughter, quiet evenings where she'd read by the window while her husband watched his baseball games. The master bedroom upstairs had been her retreat, filled with family photos, her grandmother's antique jewelry box, and the quilt her mother had sewn by hand during the long winter of 1963. Her weekly routine was as predictable as sunrise: Monday grocery shopping, Tuesday book club at the library, Wednesday volunteering at the community center, Thursday coffee with her neighbor Helen, and Friday afternoon tea with Claire and little Emma. Margaret's days were full of purpose, woven together by the threads of family obligation and genuine love. She'd worked as a school secretary for 35 years, watching generations of children grow up, remembering their names long after they'd forgotten hers. Her retirement had been modest but comfortable, supplemented by her husband's pension and the life insurance policy they'd faithfully paid into for decades. She wasn't wealthy, but she had enough to help her family when they needed it, and that had always been enough for her. The heart attack came without warning on a Tuesday evening in October. One moment she was watering her African violets, the next she was crumpled on the kitchen floor, chest burning like fire. If not for Helen peeking through the window to return a borrowed casserole dish, Margaret might not have survived the night. The paramedics said she was lucky. The blockage could have killed her instantly. But as she lay in the hospital bed, connected to machines that beeped her heartbeat into the sterile air, Margaret wondered if luck was the right word for what was about to unfold. The first sign that something had shifted came on day 5 of her hospital stay. Claire's visits, which had started with tearful bedside vigils, became shorter and more infrequent. Where she'd once stayed for hours, holding Margaret's hand and reading aloud from her favorite magazines, now she seemed restless, checking her phone constantly and making excuses about needing to get back to Emma or help Derek with something urgent. Margaret tried to dismiss the growing unease in her chest. Heart patients were often paranoid, the nurses had told her. The medication could cause anxiety, make her imagine problems that weren't there. But the silence on the other end of the phone when she called home began to feel heavier than the weight of her own healing heart. "Mom, you need to focus on getting better," Claire would say whenever Margaret asked about the house, about her plants, about the mail piling up. "Don't worry about anything else. Derek and I have everything handled." But there was something in her daughter's voice, a note of impatience, maybe even guilt, that made Margaret's pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with her cardiac condition. The nurses commented on how quiet her room had become. "Most patients your age have visitors coming and going all day," said Rita, the kind woman who worked the evening shift. "Your daughter seems lovely, but where's the rest of your family, your friends from church or the neighborhood?" Margaret found herself making excuses she didn't believe, explaining that everyone was busy, that she didn't want to be a burden. Helen had called twice in the first week, but when Margaret asked Claire to give her the room number, Claire claimed Helen hadn't called at all. The book club ladies had supposedly sent flowers, but Margaret never saw them. Even the neighbors who'd been like family for decades seemed to have vanished into thin air. It was as if the world beyond her hospital room had quietly erased her from their daily lives. On day 12, Margaret overheard Claire on the phone in the hospital hallway. Her daughter's voice carried through the partially open door, and though Margaret couldn't make out every word, she heard enough to make her blood run cold. "Easier this way," Claire was saying. "She'll understand eventually. And most chilling of all, we can't wait forever, Derek, the realtor says." Margaret's heart monitor began beeping frantically, bringing nurses running. But the racing pulse had nothing to do with her physical condition, and everything to do with the growing certainty that the people she'd trusted most in the world were planning something that would shatter her life even more completely than the heart attack had. The morning Margaret was finally cleared to go home, Claire arrived with a strange mixture of forced cheerfulness and barely concealed nervousness. She'd brought a small overnight bag and explained that Margaret would be staying temporarily at Claire and Derek's house while she recovered. "Just until you're stronger, Mom. The doctor says you shouldn't be alone." But Margaret had spoken to Dr. Patterson herself just an hour earlier, and he'd said no such thing. He'd cleared her for independent living with basic precautions, no heavy lifting, regular medication, and follow-up appointments. The confusion made her temples throb, but she was too weak to argue and too desperate to leave the antiseptic prison of room 314. The 20-minute drive to Claire's house felt like a funeral procession. Margaret stared out the window at the familiar streets, noting how the maple leaves had turned brilliant orange in her absence, how Mrs. Chen had finally replaced her broken mailbox, how the coffee shop on 3rd Street had painted their shutters a cheerful yellow. Life had continued without her, marking time in small changes she'd missed while fighting for her own survival. Claire's house was smaller than Margaret remembered, cluttered with Emma's college textbooks and Derek's work papers. The guest room smelled of mothballs and had a narrow single bed that made Margaret's back ache just looking at it. "We'll make you comfortable here," Claire said, but her eyes wouldn't meet Margaret's. "You can rest and recuperate, and we'll take care of everything." It was Derek who finally let the truth slip, 3 days into her stay. Margaret had been feeling stronger and mentioned wanting to check on her house, maybe pick up some of her own clothes and books. Derek's face went pale, and he glanced at Claire with the look of a man who'd been caught in a lie. "Well, the thing is, Margaret," he began, then stopped, clearly realizing he'd said too much. Claire's explosion of anger was swift and directed entirely at her husband. "Derek, we talked about this. You promised to let me handle it." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Margaret sat in the uncomfortable guest chair, watching her daughter and son-in-law argue about her life as if she wasn't in the room. The truth came out in angry fragments. While Margaret had been fighting for her life, Claire and Derek had been fighting for her house. They'd consulted with a lawyer about having Margaret declared mentally incompetent. They'd talked to a realtor about the property value. They'd even gone so far as to have the locks changed for security reasons while the house sat empty. "We were worried about you, Mom," Claire said, tears streaming down her face. "You're getting older, and after the heart attack we thought it would be better if you were closer to family. The house is too big for you, too much work. We could sell it and use the money for your care." But Margaret heard what wasn't being said. Claire and Derek were drowning in Emma's college expenses and Derek's business debts. They'd seen Margaret's house, mortgage-free and sitting on valuable land, as their salvation. Her near-death experience had simply moved up their timeline. The next morning, Margaret insisted on going to see her house. Claire tried to dissuade her, claiming she was too weak, but Margaret's voice carried a steel that surprised them both. "I am going to see my home, Claire. You can drive me, or I can call a taxi, but I am going." The ride to Maple Street happened in suffocating silence. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs, but not from exertion, from the terrible anticipation of seeing what they'd done to her sanctuary. The house looked smaller somehow, abandoned despite being occupied for only 3 weeks. The lawn had grown shaggy, and her carefully tended flower beds showed signs of neglect. The key that had worked for 37 years no longer fit the front door. Margaret stood on her own porch, holding the useless metal while Claire fumbled with explanations about security upgrades and safety measures. A new deadbolt gleamed like an accusation above the familiar old handle. Derek had to be called to come unlock what had been Margaret's own front door. Inside, the house felt like a museum of her former life. Everything was exactly as she'd left it, but somehow different, as if the very air had been drained of the warmth that made it home. Margaret moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching familiar objects that now felt like artifacts from someone else's life. The real shock came when she reached the master bedroom. A shiny new deadbolt had been installed on the inside of the door, and Margaret could hear movement within, drawers opening and closing, papers rustling, voices speaking in hushed tones. She knocked on her own bedroom door, and the sounds stopped immediately. "Who's in there?" Margaret called out, her voice stronger than she felt. Claire's face had gone white, and Derek was nowhere to be found. The silence stretched like a held breath until finally, reluctantly, the door opened. A young woman, Garrett didn't recognize, stood in the doorway, surrounded by boxes and packing materials. Behind her, Margaret could see strangers going through her personal belongings, her jewelry box open on the dresser, her photo album stacked in a corner, her late husband's clothes folded into cardboard boxes as if they were donations to charity. "Mom, I can explain," Claire began, but Margaret's world had already tilted beyond the point of explanation. These people weren't family friends or cleaning service. They were estate sale specialists, brought in to evaluate and price the contents of her life. While Margaret had been fighting to survive, Claire had been planning to erase her existence entirely. The betrayal cut deeper than the scalpel that had opened her chest. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about being erased, written out of her own story before the final chapter had even been written. Margaret sank into her favorite reading chair, the one piece of furniture the strangers hadn't yet touched, and felt something inside her break that had nothing to do with cardiac muscle. The confrontation that followed was brutal in its quiet intensity. Margaret sat in her living room while Claire paced, and Derek stood by the window, looking as if he wished he could disappear through the glass. The estate sale people had retreated to the kitchen, but Margaret could still hear them discussing the value of her grandmother's china, reducing a lifetime of memories to dollar signs and profit margins. "You don't understand the pressure we're under," Claire said, her voice taking on the whining tone Margaret remembered from her teenage years. "Emma's tuition is due, Derek's business is struggling, and we're drowning in debt. The house is just sitting here, Mom. You can't maintain it anymore, not after what happened." Margaret wanted to scream that she'd been home for less than a day, that she hadn't even had a chance to try maintaining anything. But the fight had drained out of her, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion that made her bones ache. She looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw a stranger wearing Claire's face. "I raised you better than this," Margaret said quietly. The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples of shame that crossed Claire's features before hardening into defensive anger. "You raised me to be practical," Claire shot back. "To think about the future, to plan ahead. That's all we're doing. We're thinking about your future, about what's best for everyone." But Margaret could see the truth in the boxes stacked in her bedroom, in the real estate brochures Derek tried to hide behind his back, in the way they'd changed the locks before she'd even been discharged. This wasn't about her future, it was about eliminating her from theirs. The ride back to Claire's house was a tomb of silence. Margaret stared out the window at the neighborhood she'd called home for nearly 40 years, knowing she might never see it again. And as anything other than a visitor, the familiar streets blurred together through tears she refused to let fall in front of her daughter. Back in the cramped guest room, Margaret sat on the narrow bed and tried to process what had happened. The people she'd trusted most in the world had systematically dismantled her life while she fought for survival. They'd isolated her from friends, controlled her information, and made irreversible decisions about her future without her consent. The silence in the house was oppressive. Claire and Derek spoke in whispers when they thought she couldn't hear, their conversations stopping abruptly whenever she entered a room. Emma called from college, but Claire intercepted the calls, claiming Margaret was too tired to talk. Even the television seemed to conspire against her, with Claire controlling the remote and choosing programs that Margaret had no interest in watching. Sleep became Margaret's only escape, but even that was haunted by dreams of locked doors and voices on the other side, making decisions about her life while she remained powerless to stop them. On the 7th day of her imprisonment, for that's what Margaret had come to call her stay at Claire's house, salvation arrived in the form of Helen Rodriguez, her 70-year-old neighbor who had the determination of a bloodhound and the subtlety of a freight train. Margaret was sitting in the garden when she heard the commotion at the front door. Helen's voice, sharp with indignation, cut through the afternoon air like a blade. "Don't you dare tell me she's not available, young lady. I've been calling this house for a week, and I know Margaret is here." Claire's attempts to deflect Helen were no match for a woman who had raised 4 sons and taught high school Spanish for 35 years. Within minutes, Helen had marched into the backyard, her silver hair gleaming in the sunlight and her dark eyes blazing with protective fury. "Mija," Helen said, using the Spanish endearment she'd called Margaret for 20 years. "What in God's name is going on here?" She pulled Margaret into a fierce hug that smelled of lavender and righteous anger. "I've been worried sick. No one would tell me anything about you." For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt the ice around her heart begin to crack. Helen's presence was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, reminding her that there were still people in the world who cared about her as a person, not as a financial problem to be solved. "I tried to visit you in the hospital," Helen continued, settling into the lawn chair beside Margaret. "But when I called, they said you weren't taking visitors. Then I went to your house to check on things, and there were strangers there, packing up your belongings like you were dead." Margaret's composure finally crumbled. The tears she'd been holding back for days poured out in great, gulping sobs that shook her whole body. Helen held her hand and let her cry, occasionally murmuring soothing words in Spanish that Margaret didn't understand but felt in her bones. "Tell me everything," Helen said when the storm had passed. And Margaret did. She told Helen about the hospital, about the overheard phone calls, about coming home to find her bedroom locked and strangers pricing her possessions. She told her about the changed locks and the estate sale people and the real estate brochures. Helen's face grew darker with each revelation. When Margaret finished, Helen sat in silence for a long moment, her jaw working as if she were chewing on something bitter. "That's elder abuse," she said finally. "What they're doing to you is illegal, Mija. You know that, don't you?" Margaret hadn't known. In her heart, she'd felt wronged and betrayed, but she'd assumed that as her daughter, Claire had the right to make decisions about her welfare. The idea that there were laws protecting her, that what felt like betrayal might actually be criminal, had never occurred to her. "My nephew is a lawyer," Helen continued. "He specializes in elder care and estate planning. Would you like me to call him?" For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt a spark of something that might have been hope. She looked toward the house where she could see Claire watching them through the kitchen window and made a decision that would change everything. "Yes," Margaret said, her voice steady for the first time since she'd come home from the hospital. "I think I would." Helen's nephew, Miguel Rodriguez, arrived the next morning with a briefcase full of legal documents and a gentle manner that reminded Margaret of her late husband. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 45, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the patient demeanor of someone who'd seen too many families torn apart by greed and fear. They met at the public library, away from Claire's watchful eyes. Margaret had told her daughter she was going to physical therapy, which wasn't entirely a lie. She was indeed working to rebuild her strength, just not in the way Claire imagined. "Mrs. Thompson," Miguel said, spreading papers across the study table. "I want you to understand that what's happening to you is not uncommon, but it is illegal. Your daughter has no legal right to make decisions about your property or your living situation without your consent, regardless of your health status." The relief Margaret felt was overwhelming. For weeks, she'd been made to feel like a burden, like someone whose opinions no longer mattered because she'd had the audacity to get sick. But Miguel's calm recitation of her rights made her feel human again, like a person whose voice still carried weight in the world. "The first thing we need to do," Miguel continued, "is establish that you are mentally competent to make your own decisions. Your daughter may have been exploring legal guardianship, but that requires a court hearing and medical evidence of incapacity. From what I can see, you're perfectly capable of managing your own affairs." Margaret thought about the estate sale people in her bedroom, the changed locks, the whispered conversations about her future. "What can we do about my house? They've changed the locks and there are strangers going through my things." Miguel made notes on a legal pad, his expression growing more serious. "That's trespassing and conversio of property. We can get a court order to have them removed and the locks changed back. But Mrs. Thompson, I need to ask you something difficult. Are you prepared for the possibility that your relationship with your daughter might not survive this?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Margaret thought about Claire as a little girl, how she'd run to Margaret's arms when she scraped her knee, how she'd called her mom her best friend on her wedding day. But she also thought about the locked bedroom door, the whispered phone calls, the way Claire had looked at her in the hospital, not with love or concern, but with the calculating gaze of someone sizing up an obstacle. "I raised her to be honest and kind," Margaret said finally. "If she can't be those things with me, then maybe we don't have a relationship worth saving." Miguel nodded respectfully. "Then let's get your life back, Mrs. Thompson." Over the next several hours, they crafted a plan. Miguel would file for an emergency court order to regain access to Margaret's house and remove the unauthorized occupants. He would also investigate the financial irregularities, the estate sale preparations, the real estate consultations, any attempts to access Margaret's bank accounts or change her legal documents. But most importantly, he would help Margaret reclaim her voice. "The law is on your side," he said as they prepared to leave. "But you'll need to be strong. Your daughter isn't going to give up easily, and this is going to get uncomfortable before it gets better." Margaret thought about the narrow bed in Claire's guest room, about the whispered conversations and controlled phone calls, about the way she'd been made to feel like a ghost in her own life. "I've been uncomfortable for weeks," she said. "At least now I'll be uncomfortable while fighting back." The court order came through on a Thursday morning, delivered by a sheriff's deputy who looked as if he'd rather be anywhere else. Margaret stood on the sidewalk in front of her house, flanked by Miguel and Helen, watching as the estate sale people emerged with their boxes and clipboards, their faces sullen with the disappointment of interrupted profit. Claire's car screeched to a halt at the curb just as the locksmith finished changing the locks back. Margaret's daughter erupted from the driver's seat like a fury, her face red with rage and something that might have been panic. "What do you think you're doing?" Claire screamed, advancing on Margaret with her fists clenched. "This is insane! You can't live here alone! You just had a heart attack! You could die!" "I could die anywhere," Margaret replied calmly, accepting the new keys from the locksmith. "At least here, I'll die in my own home, making my own decisions." The next hour was a blur of accusations and threats. Claire accused Margaret of being manipulated by strangers who didn't understand their family dynamics. She claimed to have Margaret's best interests at heart, that the house was too much for her to handle, that she was being selfish and unreasonable. Derek arrived shortly after, his face ashen as he surveyed the scene. The estate sale people had left, taking their evaluation sheets and price tags with them. The real estate agent showed up, confused and flustered, clutching a listing agreement that would never be signed. "Mrs. Thompson," Derek said, his voice carefully controlled. "Please be reasonable. We're family. We can work this out without lawyers and court orders." But Margaret was done being reasonable. She'd been reasonable when they changed her locks. She'd been reasonable when they brought strangers into her bedroom. She'd been reasonable when they discussed her future as if she were already dead. "You want to know what's reasonable?" Margaret said, her voice carrying across the yard to where neighbors had begun to gather. "Reasonable is asking someone before you sell their house. Reasonable is including someone in decisions about their own life. Reasonable is treating your mother like a human being instead of a problem to be solved. The crowd of neighbors began to murmur among themselves. Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. The young couple from the corner house looked shocked. Even the mailman had stopped to watch, his bag of letters forgotten in his hands. Claire's face crumpled into tears, but Margaret had seen those tears before. They were the tears of someone who'd been caught, not someone who was genuinely sorry. "You're making a mistake, Mom," Claire said, her voice breaking. "You're going to regret this." Margaret looked at her daughter, this woman she'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, and felt something settle into place inside her chest. "The only thing I regret," she said quietly, "is that it took me so long to stand up for myself." Miguel stepped forward with a folder of papers. "Mrs. Thompson, these are restraining orders. Your daughter and son-in-law are not to enter your property or contact you without your permission. Any attempts to interfere with your finances or property will result in criminal charges." As Claire and Derek drove away, their faces masks of defeated fury, Margaret stood in her driveway and felt the sun on her face for the first time in weeks. The neighbors gradually dispersed, but not before several of them approached to offer help, to express their confusion about her sudden disappearance, to welcome her home. Helen squeezed her hand. "How does it feel, Mija?" Margaret looked at her house, at the door that now opened to her key, at the windows that reflected her own face back at her. "It feels like coming back to life," she said. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Miguel's investigation revealed that Claire and Derek had been planning their takeover for months, even before Margaret's heart attack. They'd consulted with multiple lawyers about guardianship procedures, met with several real estate agents about property values, and even opened a joint account in preparation for managing Margaret's estate. The paper trail was damning. Email exchanges between Claire and Derek revealed their true motivations: Emma's college expenses, Derek's failing business, and their mounting credit card debt. Margaret's house wasn't just a solution to their financial problems. It was their retirement plan, their children's inheritance, their ticket to a comfortable future. But the most shocking discovery came when Miguel subpoenaed Margaret's medical records. Dr. Patterson had never recommended that Margaret be placed in supervised care. In fact, his notes indicated that she was an ideal candidate for independent living post-recovery. Claire had lied about the doctor's recommendations, just as she'd lied about so many other things. The criminal charges were filed on a Tuesday morning in November: elder abuse, financial exploitation, trespassing, and conversion of property. Derek, as the primary instigator, faced the most serious charges. Claire, as Margaret's daughter, faced additional charges related to breach of fiduciary duty. Margaret sat in the courtroom, watching as her daughter and son-in-law were formally charged with crimes against her. She felt no satisfaction, only a deep sadness for the family that had been destroyed by greed and fear. Emma, home from college for the hearing, sat with tears streaming down her face, caught between the grandmother she loved and the parents who had betrayed that love. But justice came in forms beyond the courtroom. The story of Margaret's ordeal spread through the community like wildfire, carried by the neighbors who had witnessed the confrontation, the hospital staff who remembered Claire's odd behavior, the estate sale people who'd been uncomfortable with the rushed timeline. Claire's reputation in the community was shattered. The book club she'd belonged to asked her to leave. The country club where she'd been a member since Emma was born quietly revoked her membership. Even the grocery store clerks treated her with cool politeness, instead of the warm familiarity she'd once enjoyed. Derek's business, already struggling, collapsed entirely when his clients learned about the charges. No one wanted to work with a man who would exploit his own mother-in-law for financial gain. Their house went up for sale within a month, and they were forced to move across town to a smaller apartment. Emma, caught in the middle, made a choice that surprised everyone. She dropped out of college mid-semester and got a job at a local bookstore, determined to pay her own way rather than benefit from her parents' betrayal. She visited Margaret regularly, their relationship slowly healing through honest conversations and shared tears. "I should have known," Emma said one afternoon as they sat in Margaret's garden, watching the last of the autumn leaves fall. "I should have asked questions when Mom said you were too sick for visitors." Margaret reached over and took her granddaughter's hand. "You were a child, trying to trust the adults in your life. That's not your fault, sweetheart. That's theirs." The house on Maple Street, which had nearly been sold to pay for others' mistakes, became a symbol of something more powerful than property rights. It became a testament to the idea that every person, regardless of age or health, deserves to have their voice heard and their choices respected. 6 months after the court orders were filed, Margaret stood in her kitchen making coffee for Helen, who had become a daily presence in her life. The routine they'd established was comfortable and healing. Helen would arrive around 10 with fresh pastries from the Mexican bakery, and they'd spend the morning in Margaret's garden, talking about everything and nothing. The legal proceedings had concluded with plea agreements. Derek received 2 years of probation and substantial fines. Claire received 1 year of probation and was required to attend counseling for financial responsibility and elder care ethics. Both were required to pay restitution for the costs of the estate sale preparation and legal fees. But the real resolution came on a quiet Tuesday evening in spring. Margaret was reading on her front porch when Claire's car pulled into the driveway. Her daughter sat in the car for a long time before finally getting out, her face pale and drawn. "Mom," Claire said, standing at the bottom of the porch steps like a child asking permission to come home. "I know I don't deserve to be here. I know I hurt you in ways I can't take back. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. Really, truly sorry." Margaret looked at her daughter. This woman who had raised her fist against her own mother, who had tried to steal her home and her autonomy, who had treated her like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. But she also saw the little girl who had once brought her dandelions and called them flowers, who had cried on her shoulder after her first heartbreak, who had asked her to be in the delivery room when Emma was born. "I'm sorry too," Margaret said finally. "I'm sorry that I raised you to think love could be measured in dollars and cents. I'm sorry that I didn't teach you better about what really matters in life." Claire climbed the steps slowly, as if approach it, a wild animal that might bolt. Can we try again? I know I can't undo what I did, but maybe we can find a way forward?" Margaret considered the question. The trust between them was broken, perhaps irreparably. The easy intimacy of their former relationship was gone, replaced by the careful politeness of people who had hurt each other deeply. But Emma needed her grandmother, and Margaret had learned that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about choosing to build something new from the pieces of what had been destroyed. "We can try," Margaret said, "but things will be different now. I make my own decisions about my life, my house, my future. You can be part of that conversation, but you don't get to control it." Claire nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand. I just want to be your daughter again." Margaret reached out and took Claire's hand, noting how much older it looked than she remembered. "You never stopped being my daughter," she said gently. "You just forgot how to be one." As they sat on the porch in the gathering dusk, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the peace of resolution, but the peace of knowing that she had the strength to protect herself and the wisdom to extend grace when it was deserved. Helen appeared from next door, carrying a plate of homemade tamales and wearing the satisfied expression of a woman who had witnessed justice served. "I thought I saw a car," she said, settling into the third porch chair as if she belonged there. Which, Margaret realized, she did. The three women sat together as the sun set over Maple Street, talking softly about small things, the weather, the neighbors, the new family moving in down the block. It wasn't the family Margaret had imagined, but it was the family she had chosen, and that made all the difference. Later that night, as Margaret prepared for bed in her own room, with her own key in her own lock, She thought about the journey that had brought her here. The heart attack that had nearly killed her had actually saved her life, forcing her to discover strength she didn't know she possessed, and showing her the difference between people who loved her and people who needed her. She pulled out her journal, a habit she'd started during her recovery, and wrote the words that had become her daily affirmation. I am Margaret Thompson. I am 62 years old. I survived a heart attack and a betrayal. I have my own home, my own voice, and my own choices. I am not a burden. I am not a problem. I am a person worthy of love and respect. Outside her window, the street she'd called home for nearly 40 years stretched into darkness, but it no longer felt like a place where she was waiting to die. It felt like a place where she was learning to live again, one choice at a time. Moral of the story: age and illness do not diminish your worth or your right to make decisions about your own life. Sometimes the greatest act of love is standing up for yourself, even when it costs you the approval of those you love most. Your voice matters, your choices matter, and you are never too old to start over with dignity and strength.